This is a modern battle group, and it represents today's most advanced naval firepower. This British group consists of many different vessels acting in unison to create a single unit. However, it is the aircraft carriers that are the major component of this fleet. Its role is to combine air power to the fleet's sea power. In this case, the aircraft are the Harrier jump jet and various helicopters. The other prominent vessel of the fleet is the submarine, and a fleet of this size may have more than one. The submarine's role has changed much, but one aspect remains the same. The submarine is a weapon of stealth. This fleet's submarine contingent may be many miles ahead of the fleet and acting as the ears of the battle group. The submarine can be employed as a passive or aggressive member of the fleet. Today's modern submarine has a teardrop-shaped bow. This is a French Rubes-class submarine, which were built between 1986 and 1993. The teardrop hull design vastly improved the submerged speed of the submarine. Previous to this hydrodynamic improvement, submarines were not able to catch ships while submerged. Today, they have a greater submerged speed than surface speed and can easily keep up with the carrier battle group. Probably the most recognised class of teardrop-shaped submarines is the Ohio class, which was featured in the Hollywood blockbuster Hunt for Red October. This single vessel has more firepower than all the bombs used throughout the entire Second World War. These submarines are often referred to as boomers, and were designed in the 1970s at a cost of over $2,000 million each. They were, until recently, the most expensive submarines to be built. They carry 24 ballistic missiles. Seen here is the Trident C4 version. The Ohio class and its counterparts are perhaps the most deadly weapon of war to be built. They can strike with little or no warning under a cloak of extreme stealth.
Prepare one.
This is a test of a C4 Trident launch. The missile is ejected in a column of compressed gas. Upon reaching the surface, the missile fires the first of its 3 stages of rockets. The C4 has a range of over 4,000 miles, and the main missile holds 8 individual missiles, which can be independently targeted. Each of the 8 missiles has a 100 kiloton warhead, which is approximately 5 times greater than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Submarines today have many roles. They can sit quietly and passively, gathering information. They can attack enemy ships, both merchant and naval, or they can be used as nuclear strike platforms. Although submarines were used in World War I, their true potential wasn't realised until World War II. Admiral Donitz was in charge of the German U-boat campaign. He had served in World War I as a submariner, and had first-hand experience of what a submarine could become capable of. Donitz maintained very close relationships with his captains. He would meet his returning crews and pass down the ranks and shake hands with each man and bestow medals. Both Donitz and his superiors believed the key to victory was to stifle the Allies' supply line. Donitz pushed forcibly to build and use submarines to cripple the supply lines. However, his superiors saw more advantage with the traditional and proven battleship. Donitz's insistence of the advantages of submarines lasted throughout the war. Over 300 submarines would have been needed to dominate the British Navy and break merchant supply lines. However, at the start of the war, Germany had a mere 28. These submarines were also inadequate to serve on the high seas, and were mainly of coastal type classes. Both Grand Admiral Erich Rieder and Donitz knew the war was 6 years too early for the German Navy. However, with the limitations of U-boat numbers, Donitz showed incredible success in the Atlantic and North Sea. The world was not prepared for submarine warfare. The merchant ships were unescorted and scattered. They were easy targets. They were so easy that the U-boats would surface and give the ship's crew time to abandon ship before sinking the vessel with their forward-mounted guns. Throughout the early stages of the war, the U-boats continued unchallenged in their objective to block the shipping lanes. The only advantage at this time for the merchant seamen was speed. The U-boats could only intercept them. If sighted, the merchant vessel could easily outrun them. The first initiative to curb the high casualty count was the development of moving ships in convoys, which were escorted by destroyers and other fighting ships. Many merchant ships were also fitted with 4-inch or similar guns. However, anti-submarine warfare was still in its infancy, and losses remained high. In fact, Donitz created a new way to deal with convoys. He developed the Wolf Pack. When a convoy was sighted, the U-boat captain radioed its position, direction and speed to HQ, where Donitz and his staff plotted courses for other U-boats to also intercept. The U-boats would shadow the convoy by day and attack under the cover of night. The U-boats were slow when submerged. However, on the surface, they could reach 16 knots. The merchantman's only way of detecting a U-boat was visually, and at night, the low profile of the U-boat was difficult to see, which allowed the U-boat to close in on its target before diving. The wolf packs were extremely successful, and some U-boat captains were even able to slip into the convoy formation and attack within. This caused even greater confusion to the merchant vessels and their escorts. The losses of merchant ships continued into late 41. These losses could not continue for much longer, otherwise the war was lost. The English had to counter the U-boat threat. Within the U-boat fraternity, this period was known as the Happy Days. However, the tide was about to turn. Donitz's Wolfpack system heavily relied on radio communication, and this was the system's flaw. Radio directional fighting equipment was developed. The British were able to hone in on the direction of the Germans' radio signal, which lifted the U-boat's veil of stealth. But a bigger development was radar. The escort ships could now detect surface U-boats at much greater distances. Great advances in aviation also played a role in the U-boat's demise. The aerial coverage of shipping lanes was vastly increased, and spotter planes were also equipped with radar. Any surfaced U-boat at this time was in jeopardy. To add to the peril of the U-boat crews, the Americans joined the war and supplied Allied forces with even more radar-equipped aircraft to further broaden and intensify the search for surfaced U-boats. At the end of the war, the tally was 288 U-boat losses to air attack. An even more deadly tool was devised, the early sonar. An underwater sound pulse was sent out, and like radar, the return signal revealed the presence of the U-boat. Now they could be detected on the surface and hunted down while they were submerged. These developments were the birth of today's anti-submarine warfare. The total number of U-boats sunk or captured is approximately 780. Towards the end of the war, a U-boat was not expected to complete more than 2 missions before being destroyed. After Hitler's death, Grand Admiral Donitz was appointed head of state, and on May the 4th, he gave the order for U-boats to cease hostility. In a final address to his beloved U-boat crews, he stated, "My U-boat men, 6 years of warfare lay behind us. You have fought like lions. A crushing superiority has compressed into a very narrow area. The continuation of the struggle from the bases which remain. Unbroken in your warlike courage, you are laying down your arms after an heroic fight which knows no equal. In reverence memory, we think of our comrades who have died. Comrades, maintain your U-boat spirit in which you fought most bravely and unflinchingly during the long years." It was a fitting tribute to a brave and dedicated service of the 39,000 men who served in U-boats. 5,000 had been captured and near 28,000 killed in action. If Donitz had the quantity of U-boats at the outset of the war, it is very possible that Germany may have been able to cripple Britain by denying it much needed food, oil and military hardware supplies. Churchill confirms this when he stated, "They were the only thing that really frightened me." This is HMS Unseen of the RANS Upholder class of hunter-killer diesel-electric submarines. This class is an example of the early teardrop-shaped hulls. At this time, more computer and technically advanced weapon systems were being installed in submarines. These were a radical change from the early World War II vintage design. Perhaps of most interest is the class of submarine, which depicts the pinnacle of World War II's submarine development. The Oberon class is exactly this pinnacle. These submarines were very quiet for their day and stayed in service with various navies past the year 2000. At the time, they were state-of-the-art conventional subs, despite being based on a late World War II German hull design. The last of the O-boats in RN service were paid off during the 1990s. Australia purchased 6 Oberon-class boats from the United Kingdom and commissioned them Oxley, Otway, Ovens, Onslow, Orion and Otama. They served the RAN and Australia for 3 decades.
Open main events.
Open main vents. Full dive on the planes.
Over the years, many of the vessels were heavily modified in the weapon systems area. Further upgrades included the ability to fire Mark 48 torpedoes, which could carry a nuclear ordnance.
75 feet back to 52.
75 back to 52, roger sir.
Roger, you have Q.
Located at the Western Australia Maritime Museum is Oberon HMAS Ovens. What is interesting is that the Ovens' final resting place is an actual World War II submarine slipway. This Australian city of Fremantle was the largest Allied submarine base outside of the United States. Ovens would be considered a medium-sized submarine. It is interesting to note that HMAS Ovens was only the second conventional submarine to fire a subsurface launched harpoon missile. Consequently, the boat's designation changed from SS to SSG. Entrance to the submarine is via a 30-foot high stairway, and the view over the area can only make the visitor ponder the landscape during the heady days of the Fremantle base during operations in World War II. Visitors enter through the forward hatch and descend the original ladder into the forward torpedo room. Guides take the people on a journey of a lifestyle that can only be described as very alien to most of us.
The empty ones. There's no empty ones, they sleep on the floor.
Everywhere bunks are found. What is equally interesting is the amount of work required to get the submarine and maintain it in such a pristine condition. The Western Australian Maritime Museum preserved the submarine in conditions that reflect the submarine's original specifications, and they continue to hunt for even the smallest part to make the submarine as authentic as possible. This is two of Oven's sister boats, Otama on the left and Orion on the right. Otama is bound for her last seagoing adventure. However, she will not sail this trip under her own power. Max Bright, seen here, was in charge of overseeing the tow. Preparations included removing all hazardous waste from the vessel. All tanks, including fuel and ballast, had to be washed out and inspected. The Australian Navy offered their assistance to weld blanks on all the inlet and outlet openings in the hull. The submarine was then fitted with rigging required for its final 3,000-mile ocean journey. The tow took 13 days to complete, and adverse sea conditions had to be battled through the notorious waters of the Great Australian Bight and Bass Strait. Under maritime law, the Otama had to be towed unmanned. This meant that Otama was a dead ship without being able to assist in steerage, which added to this tense situation. Finally, the vessel arrived at Western Port Victoria, its final home. On a late summer's day in December, Otama slipped into the calm bay and was met by a crowd of curious onlookers and the organisers of the project. She remained hitched to the salvage vessel overnight, and early the next morning, with favourable tides, Otama was brought up the bay and moored at the town of Hastings.
Steering all right, Bob? Good, good. A gentle swing to port, please, Bob.
Once moored, work will begin to prepare Otama to be lifted from the sea and placed on land. In her new role, she will, like many other museum vessels around the world, serve to enlighten all who visit of the technical advancements of sea power, and most importantly, the bravery of the people who sailed such vessels past and present. Otama now has a new home, mission and crew. Surprisingly, some of her new crew are very familiar with the vessel. As a young man, David Hall was a cook on Otama, and on her arrival was keen to explore the vessel and seek out his old and familiar bunk. In this tiny kitchen, he prepared over 180 meals per day. His shift was 15 hours, 7 days a week. Otama closely resembles a World War II type vessel, and conditions on board reflect this. 2 toilet showers for 60 men. In the makeshift lighting of Otama, the cramped living is further accentuated. Every aspect of a submarine has procedure, even the way garbage is ejected from a specialised unit. The Oberons were possibly the most effective conventional submarine class of its time, with an astonishing reputation for quietness, which allowed it to exist in the 21st century. In fact, the ability of the O-boats to run in total silence enabled Australian submarines to successfully attack USS Enterprise, despite a huge number of supporting ships protecting it. The modern submariner and the modern submarine were born from the hearts and the metal of men and machines that have gone before. This is sea power. While the German army moved towards Warsaw, her powerful and determined navy headed out to do battle with Britain. Hitler's admirals were aware that taking command of the sea would see Britain fall. However, to control the ocean, the German navy would have to face off with the much more powerful British naval fleets. The German navy turned to the submarine as an auxiliary naval weapon to close the gap on the British advantage. Admiral Donitz was to prove that the submarine was indeed a most deadly weapon. He developed many techniques that enhanced the submarine's natural ability to sink ships. In this instance, a German U-boat is being refueled, reloaded and resupplied by another larger U-boat, called a milk cow. At the beginning of the war, Kriegsmarine, or German Navy, had no bases in other parts of the world, and the U-boats depended on supply vessels to keep them at sea. Surface vessels were too vulnerable, so the supply submarine was born. These were built around the successful Type 7 design. The milk cow's armament consisted of anti-aircraft guns only, as they were non-combatant units. The first of the 20 boats was put into service in 1941. All were sunk by Allied forces during the war. Operating a milk cow fleet allowed the fighting force to stay at sea for longer periods of time. England could not sustain the massive losses of merchant ships that the U-boats were inflicting. As the war began, England desperately tried to expand its merchant marine. But she also started to build the badly needed escort ships that would do what they could to stem the tide of losses to the U-boat attack. It was the destroyer class and also the smaller corvette class of warship that was developed throughout the war to become the natural hunter of the submarine. The English were caught off guard by the start of the war and required time to gear up for this colossal production of merchant and naval vessels. While production was underway, the strengthening of the U-boat fleet was also undertaken by the Germans, and the U-boat contingent continued to sink merchant ships at an alarming rate. A breakthrough occurred in September 1941. Although not officially at war, the Americans decided to supply escort vessels for the Atlantic routes. The Canadian government had already agreed to supply escorts. Even with American and Canadian assistance, the escort fleet was not sufficient. The job of the escort ship was to patrol the outer edge of the convoy and to try to locate and destroy U-boats. This was a near impossible task at the start of World War II, as once the U-boat was submerged, there was little a destroyer could do in the way of detection. At the beginning of the war, some destroyers did have primitive hydrophones that allowed them to listen for submarines. It was widely argued that the advent of steam had rendered the convoy system obsolete. Many felt that the necessary delays involved in assembling vessels into a convoy would take up too much time. Another factor against the convoy system was fast ships were becoming restricted to slower ship speeds. Many captains feared such close manoeuvring would result in a high risk of collision, as well as presenting an easy target for submarine attack. The British Royal Navy felt that escort convoys was too defensive as a use for their ships, and continued to advocate independent hunting. As history shows, the use of the convoy system was indeed a correct decision, and it reduced losses to U-boats dramatically from the outset. In the meantime, the Germans had developed a devastatingly successful wolf-pack technique. When a U-boat spotted a convoy, they did not rush in for the attack. The U-boat simply trailed the convoy and radioed speed and heading information to HQ. Planners then organised groups of U-boats to attack simultaneously, which spread the escorts widely and made them even less effective. Although destroyers had hydrophones to listen for submarines as a method for detection, it was primitive and could not pinpoint a target. It was not till later in the war that more effective equipment was being used. In fact, the escort vessels were fighting submarine warfare with World War I technology. So the destruction of merchant ships continued. When America joined the conflict and the Japanese declared war, the submarine and destroyer would further battle each other and broaden the theatre of war on the high seas. The Americans used the submarine to attack the Japanese merchant fleets to prevent rubber, oil, and other wartime necessities reaching the Japanese military. At this time in the war, sonar and half-daft or radio detection fighting apparatus had been developed, and anti-submarine warfare was coming of age. The Japanese destroyers could hone in on their underwater prey. No longer did the water's surface provide a cloak of invisibility for the submariner. Depth charging would continue for hours and was a grueling experience. Sonar provided exact locations, and it changed the game to the destroyer's advantage. The submarine still remained the most effective weapon to slow the supply lines, but the battle had become more equal. In all, the total loss of Japanese merchant vessels due to submarine attack was approximately 1,400 ships, or about 5 million tons. The ships included tankers with the valuable crude oil, troop ships, colliers, transport ships and naval vessels. By comparison, 52 American submarines were lost in the conflict. As anti-submarine warfare developed, the submariners of all nations found it harder to approach convoys without being detected. Once a torpedo attack began, the submarine was immediately harassed and forced to take evasive action, and the game of cat and mouse began. By the end of the war, the figures prove that the surface boats had a clear advantage. As of the 39,000 men who served the U-boats, 5,000 had been captured and near 28,000 killed in action. This is a Type 42 destroyer, also known as the Sheffield class. The class was designed in the late 1960s to provide area air defence for the Royal Navy. In total, 14 vessels were constructed. 11 remain in service today. This vessel is representative of the development of the destroyer class after World War II and the different role they can play in today's Navy. The main weapon system of these destroyers is the Sea Dart and is a surface-to-air missile system. The Sea Dart is capable of Mach 2. The Sea Dart can be used in a limited fashion for surface-to-surface warfare. Although claimed to be obsolete, it is still effective against most modern missile threats, as proven by the 1991 Gulf War and the recent Iraq conflict. Targets are acquired by the ship's tracking radar systems and are then assigned to one of the tracker illuminating radars or TIRs. The TIR fixes its target and the missile is simply fired. Two ships of this class were lost in the Falklands conflict, HMAS Coventry and HMAS Sheffield. The Sheffield fell to a French-built Exocet missile, which was fired from a low-flying aircraft. To improve the ship's defence capabilities against future missile attacks, the Class 42 were fitted with 2x20mm guns and 2x30mm guns. A modern representation of an anti-submarine ship can be found in the Netherlands Kortenaar class of frigate. It has a complement of over 160 personnel, and during the later stages of the Cold War, worked with other NATO navies to protect the Atlantic approach against the massive Soviet submarine fleet. This vessel is primarily a submarine hunter, and as such has a tremendous array of technical detection equipment. Both American and European companies manufacture the equipment. The first stage of any submarine hunt is locating the submerged target. The ship has a bow-mounted Westinghouse ANSQS 505 sonar, which is connected to the anti-submarine warfare data system. The data system collects information from the sonar and other systems and processes the information to give the operators the type, heading and depth of the acquired submarine. The submarine can be tracked and the ship can be directed to intercept. The information can also be immediately transmitted to the land-based headquarters or other surface vessels. In this modern world of technological marvels, some age-old systems are still employed. The Kortenaar is both fast and agile, and these attributes make it a very capable hunter. It has a top speed of 30 knots and a range of 4,700 nautical miles at 16 knots. This vessel is able to manoeuvre equally as well astern in most sea conditions, which is another requirement of a sub-hunter. Rolls-Royce Olympus and Tyne gas turbines are used in this class. The twin Olympus turbines create 56,000 shp to attain the vessel's top speed, and the Tyne engines, which output 8,000 shp, are used to give economy and range. The ship automatically switches from one engine to the other. Two Westland Lynx helicopters further add to the ship's ability to detect and destroy submarines. The hydraulic lockdown system enables the Lynx to be used in nearly all weather conditions. The helicopters have a range of over 300 nautical miles and have sonar capability and also carry anti-submarine weaponry. The Lynx can stay aloft for more than 3 hours. General weapons carried are 2 Mark 46 torpedoes, or Mark 27 torpedoes, or Mark 81 depth charges. The Lynx can attack submarines once it has located them by sonar. The helicopter simply dips the sonar equipment into the water to detect the presence of the enemy. It is also a much faster way to cover an area than using the ship alone. Weapons of the Courtner class include a 20mm Bova, 1x76mm Otto Breda gun, 4x 12.75-inch Mark 32 torpedo tubes in 2 twin mountings, 8 launchers for Harpoon SSMs in 2 squad mounts, and 1 launcher for NATO Sea Sparrow SAMs, with a total of 24 rounds. Although built as a submarine hunter, 2 of this class were fitted out as anti-aircraft frigates. The Courtner class is now being joined by even more advanced vessels, which are now under construction. But the Courtner ships will remain in service for at least another decade. A classic example of a World War II escort vessel can be found in Australia. This is the former HMAS Whyalla corvette. Today, it's open to the public and stands as a tribute to all the crews of such vessels. It is also a story of the dedication it took to return Whyalla to its place of construction. The ship was to be taken from the water and taken 2 kilometres by road to her final resting place, the Whyalla Maritime Museum. This is quite a feat when you consider the ship's displacement weight is 659 tonnes and its length is approximately 57 metres or more than 200 feet. A cradle was built for the ship to rest on and steady her while on the road. With the cradle secured to the ship's hull, the vessel was manoeuvred to begin its ascent up the very slipway that she was launched from so many years ago. The original time frame to have the vessel moved to its new home was 3 weeks. However, disaster struck in the early stages as the ship at its cradle became stuck on the edge of the slipway. A tugboat was used to push the vessel and a fleet of tractor-power vehicles pulled the vessel in an attempt to free the Whyalla. inch by inch, the vessel was edged further out of the water. It took 5 days to get the vessel's bow to break the high water mark. At this point, the effort became more difficult, as the crew had to wait for high tide to continue the fight. In the end, it took 2 weeks to get the vessel clear of the water. The next step was to jack the ship up to a height of 1.5 metres or 5.5 feet to allow for the trailer to be fitted to the cradle. It took a further week's work to complete this task. With a number of trucks and earth-moving vehicles combining their horsepower, the vessel was finally moving. 220 tons of trailers and 328 wheels inched along the road in the final stage of the move. In January 1943, while in a deep inlet off New Guinea, she was attacked by 18 Japanese dive bombers and 6 fighters. In November 1943, HMAS Whyalla resumed escort duties off the east coast of Australia. In December 1944, she was engaged in minesweeping operations off the southeast coast of Australia. In 1945, HMAS Whyalla was attached to the British Pacific Fleet and formed part of the occupying forces that received the Japanese surrender of Hong Kong. She was paid off in May 1946 after steaming over 110,000 nautical miles during her wartime career. She continued in commercial service after the war and was modified. Today, the museum has nearly completed the restoration of returning her to her wartime specification. That concludes another episode of Seapower. Join us again when we further explore this fascinating subject. In the early 1900s, the wealth and status of a nation was directly measured by the size of its battleships. These shots of American ironclads show the state of the art at the turn of the century. The term battleship was a new contrivance to describe the largest, most powerful of these capital ships. The famous dreadnought was birthed in 1904. However, by this time, technology had also taken to the air. The Texas, patterned after dreadnought and commissioned in 1914, was the last of the true battleships. For a time, she was considered the most powerful warship afloat because of her 10 14-inch guns in 5 twin turrets. The Texas auspiciously went on to participate in both the First and Second World Wars. In 1914, the Great War saw for the first time huge technological advances in weaponry. One of these advances, the airplane, came to the fore in the war against the early submarines. The dawning of flight required some reappraisal in the uses and threats that these new weapons could pose. At the time, naval stalwarts would not believe that the flimsy fabric and string insects could threaten their battleships, which were built to withstand the fire of other battleships. Battleship construction progressed steadily through the early 1900s. However, in 1922, with construction costs spiralling out of control and threatening to bankrupt countries, the Washington Naval Reduction Treaty was signed to halt the battleship arms race. When the United States signed the treaty, they agreed to halt construction of 13 new battleships and battle cruisers presently under construction. 2 hulls went on to become the largest aircraft carriers in the world, the Lexington and Saratoga. And the rest was scrapped. Aircraft during this time were taken on as a part of the fleet, but only as reconnaissance units. They would be used to find enemy ships and targets, then guide the fleet to within range and allow the big guns to take over, while calling as a spotter the fall of shot. In the years after World War I, military thinking saw the advances that could be made in air warfare. And some far-sighted pundits professed that these new planes would eventually replace the capital ships of nations. By 1920, the battleship was still the authority of naval task forces. Developments had rapidly advanced their weapons and protected coverings with armoured decks and waterline belts protecting them against incoming attacks. If there were to be any threat from the air, the battleship would easily adapt, as it had previously, to these new, as yet unseen dangers. In America in 1921, it was determined to silence the raging debates between the new air arm and the existing naval theorists. A series of tests would be performed to finally qualify the reality of the threat presented by the formative Air Force. Planes would be sent to sink naval shipping from the air. The trial took the form of bombing one ship of each size: a submarine, a destroyer, a cruiser, and finally a battleship. The ships would be attacked successively with bigger and bigger bombs, and inspections would take place after each attack. All armed forces would take turns in the attacks, and the trials would culminate in the big event of the bombing of the battleship Ostfriesland. The war prize Ostfriesland was large at 22,000 tons and was considered to be a significant test of the new theories. As a new ship, it was designed against attack from existing battleships of the day. Tests against Ostfriesland began on July 20, when Navy and Maritime Corps planes dropped 52 bombs on the ship, and ended dramatically the next day when Martin bombers delivered the fatal blow with 11 1,000 and 2,000 pound bombs. Today, the debate rages as to whether the test had any real validity. The targets were all stationary and had no damage control or fire parties. Had they the ability to move and repair damage, the result may have been significantly different. The Ostfriesland itself stayed afloat under sustaining significant damage over a period of a day and a half. Only the final 2,000 pound bomb signalled the end, but even then she took hours to sink. Over the ensuing years, significant numbers of ageing battleships met the same sad end, while the advancements in naval power and aviation technology continued apace. When the Naval Reduction Treaty came to an end in 1936, the United States then began to build what were to become known as the fast battleships. Speed was now deemed critical to keep up with the new aircraft carriers of the fast carrier attack groups. The early battleships had a top speed of around 22 knots. However, when other navies produced 24-knot battleships and 30-knot battle cruisers, the newer North Carolina and South Dakota class battleships were made capable of 28 knots. And the new Iowa class ships would be capable of speeds in excess of 33 knots. A final class, the Montanas, were to be nearly half again as big as the Iowa class and have a maximum speed of 28 knots. Although authorised and designed, none of this class ever entered construction, as the emphasis shifted to the construction of the aircraft carriers during the Second World War. December 7, 1941. Japan used their combined Pacific Fleet in the infamous Pearl Harbor attack, consisting of 2 fast battleships, 6 aircraft carriers, 8 destroyers, 3 cruisers and submarine escorts, and a total of 360 aircraft. There had never been such an overwhelming force assembled in the Pacific arena. The attack was over in little more than 3 hours. By the end of the day, most of the US Pacific Fleet lay broken and burning. The loss of 5 battleships, Arizona, Oklahoma, California, West Virginia and Nevada, and the damage to the Maryland, Tennessee and Pennsylvania in the raid was a truly devastating blow to the American naval forces in the Pacific. However, the 3 American carriers were not damaged, having been deployed to reinforce advanced bases at Waikiki and Midway. This one fact allowed the remaining forces to hold the Midway-Hawaii front and defend the supply lines to Australia. It would not be until the last great battleship engagement in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, that battleships would again play major roles in the Pacific War. 2 Iowa-class battleships, the Iowa and the New Jersey, as well as several old battleships refitted from their damage from the Pearl Harbor attack, would face the Japanese super battleships Yamato and Musashi, and many older ships from the First World War. The fall of the Philippines would be a terrible blow to the Japanese, as it controlled most of the fuel for the fleet. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, Japan had only a handful of planes and even fewer pilots to man them. So plans were drawn up for a huge naval attack against the US forces. The result would be an all-or-nothing gamble for the Japanese Navy. Nothing was held back. The Japanese 65,000-ton battleship Yamato was built in 1941 at Kure, Japan. She and her sister Musashi were by far the largest battleships ever built, even exceeding in size and gun caliber of the US Navy's cancelled Montana class. Their 9 18.1-inch main battery guns, which fired 3,200-pound armour-piercing shells, were the largest battleship guns ever to go to sea, and the scale of the 2 ships' armour protection was also unsurpassed. The Musashi was finally lost on the 24th of October during the Leyte Gulf battles. Her extensive protection ultimately failed her after being subjected to 20 torpedo hits, 17 bomb hits, and the destructive force of the detonation of 16 near misses in the water. At about 7:30 in the evening, 4.5 hours after the last attack, she would finally roll over and sink. The Yamato would use its large guns in Leyte against US escort carriers, but she would never fire on her American equivalents. Halsey's fleet of fast battleships sailed ineffectually between the 2 major engagements of Leyte, unable to participate due to confusion in the messages sent between the individual fleets. And so an era came to a close. The battleship never again fired guns at an enemy ship. And yet, even as the age of the battleship ended, overrun by the power of the aircraft carrier, only the disengagement of the Japanese forces at the last minute saved the day for the Americans at Leyte. The carriers would now become the king of the fleet, and within a year, the war would be over. The Nagato would be the sole Japanese battleship to survive the war. However, after the conflict, she joined her distant cousins, the American battleships Arkansas, New York, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. The Nagato would be sunk at Bikini Atoll, near the German cruiser Prinz Eugen, during the testing of atomic weapons. At the close of the war, however, it was again the grandness of the battleship that was chosen for the formal surrender of the Imperial forces. USS Missouri played host to the cessation of hostilities in the Pacific from the Bay of Tokyo. On September 2, 1945, amid the wreckage of the once proud Japanese fleet, the Missouri transmitted the ceasefire message. And on her foredeck, the signing of the official surrender was confirmed. The Iowa-class ships went on to see active service again in the Korean conflict and were used for shore bombardment in support of ground troops. Their mere presence and large guns were a huge asset in any conflict. However, with the spiralling costs of running 4 ships, they were all decommissioned by the late 1950s. Due to calls from the Marines, the New Jersey was reactivated for the Vietnam conflict in 1968, but again mothballed in 1969. During the 1980s, all 4 Iowas were recommissioned and significantly modernised. They were all converted to using light diesel fuel, and communications received enormous upgrades. They also received weapons upgrades with the addition of 16 Harpoon anti-shipping missiles and 32 Tomahawk cruise missiles for conventional or nuclear shore attack and enemy shipping. Their large 16-inch guns were maintained, and 6 of their original twin 5-inch guns were also kept. The existing range of the 16-inch guns of 24 miles was nearly doubled with new sub-caliber rounds. The addition of Harpoon missiles for surface-to-surface combatants extended their effectiveness. With a range in excess of 67 nautical miles and surface skimming the water, the Harpoons greatly extended the operational sphere of the Great Ladies. However, it was the addition of the Tomahawk cruise missiles where they again rose in stature during the 1991 Desert Shield operation. With a range of 1,500 miles, these small pilotless planes are incredibly accurate and capable of delivering conventional warheads or nuclear stores. By the mid-90s though, all of these great battleships had again been decommissioned. 2, Iowa and Wisconsin, were in mothballs. The other 2, Missouri and New Jersey, were serving a new purpose as restored museum pieces and memorials to their great places in history. Today, the US Navy is without an active battleship. However, many of the Grand Ladies are still accessible to the public. One of the greatest of all is the Texas. The battleship Texas is the last dreadnought in existence in the world. A veteran of Veracruz and both World Wars. Having been designed in the first decade of the 20th century, and having seen action in some of the most intense and critical campaigns of World War II, she is an important piece of our naval and maritime history. These are Sea Cadets spending a weekend aboard the Texas. These cadets will join over 100 other men and women participating in the annual Battle Stations 1944 event, a recreation of life aboard the Texas during World War II. When the Texas was commissioned in 1914, she was the most powerful weapon on Earth. Today, she is the US's oldest surviving battleship. With a crew of up to 1,800 men living in her 572-foot hull, sailors served their country and made sacrifices in the name of the service and country. The Sea Cadets live all aspects of life on board, including preparing meals, cleaning, and getting used to the confines of life at sea. To many, it leaves a new understanding of the trials and sacrifices made by the men that crewed the Texas.
Hot stuff coming through.
See.
May I go get my iced tea?
To those people truly interested in history, it is not enough to read a book about it or watch a film about the Texas. Here you can feel and smell what it was actually like. It's probably as close as you can get to time travel.
Just wipe it down then. Get the finger marks off. It gives them a sense of feel of what it's really like.
Now hear this. Now hear this. All hands, man your battle station. All hands, man your battle station. Now hear this. All hands, man your battle station.
Alpha Gun, Bravo Gun, man and ready, sir!
Bravo God, man ready, sir!
A portion of each day is set aside for the Living History program, where the general public can come aboard and explore different aspects of the ship.
All stop.
The high point for the reenactors is when the public, especially the children, make the realization that the stories are all true, that the history they've been told is real.
Oh, look at this, guys. You want to see what it's like to get a crew?
There's a lot of symbolism associated with the Texas and what she represents.
And you're going to be madly calling these numbers out, and there'll be 2 or 3 other guys here doing the same.
Many of the Sea Cadets did not know what living on board a battleship really entailed before they arrived. But all will leave and be slightly changed by their experiences. As time passes, the cadets will better understand what this ship represents: honor, responsibility, and personal sacrifice. The battleship Texas is a unique teaching tool. Her battle is far from over, as she has a new generation to serve. It was the Japanese carriers that brought America into the Pacific theater of World War II. When the Japanese carrier group attacked Pearl Harbor during December 1941, they destroyed a major part of the American Pacific Fleet. However, the American carriers were not in port at the time and remained intact, and were able to participate in the sea battles of the Coral Sea and Midway. And these ships were critical as they shut the door on the Japanese expansion and control of the Pacific. The carriers were equipped with the Wildcat fighter aircraft. Although a capable aircraft, it was hard-pressed to keep the devastating Zero at bay, as they were the slowest of all the US wartime fighters. However, they did have a degree of success. Their wing loading gave them better manoeuvrability than some of the other fighters of that era. But pilots had to rely on good planning and well-developed tactics to stay ahead of their opponents. The sea battles were ferocious, and the Japanese proved to be very tenacious and determined warriors, and were equipped with superior planes. The hard-fought victories of the Wildcat pilots should be respected, as they were at a disadvantage from the outset. The tactics that allowed the Wildcat pilots to fend off the Zeros were a combination of pragmatism and aggression. Whenever possible, Wildcat pilots tried to get above their opponents so that they could dive through the enemy formation in a firing pass, continuing their dive until they were able to zoom climb back up to a favourable altitude for another attack. Efforts were made to avoid close-in dogfights, where the Zero clearly had the advantage. A crisscross dogfighting tactic that compensated for the Wildcats' lack of manoeuvrability was also developed. The wingman was crucial for survival. In a dogfight, the pilot depended on his wingman to shoot an enemy pilot off his trail. The Zero fighter lacked armour protection for the pilot and did not have any self-sealing fuel tanks, and had no onboard fire extinguishing equipment. A superficial hit would often cause the aircraft to catch fire. It was also of reasonably light construction. Its weapons were of small caliber and lacked sting. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter was the finest shipboard fighter in the world during the first year of the Pacific War. It was largely obsolete by mid-1943, but it remained in production until the end of the war. It was the first shipboard fighter capable of defeating its land-based opponents. By 1943, the Zero threat had been addressed with better pilot training, better tactics, and better planes. The F-6F Hellcat was rushed into production and first entered combat on August 31, 1943. During World War II, aircraft development accelerated, and many great planes were the result. However, the Grumman Hellcat's record stands alone. This plane was a total package. It had speed and manoeuvrability, and it was extremely sturdy. The Hellcat was primarily designed to be used on carriers, although a few were flown from land bases. The Hellcats were deployed firstly to the larger carriers like the Essex class. With the rate of aircraft losses due to the Zero, the Hellcat was pressed into service as quickly as possible. They literally packed the decks of the carrier groups with the Hellcats. On April 5, 1943, a Hellcat squadron downed the first Zero, and this was the way it would be for the remainder of the war. One month later over New Guinea, another was downed, and the score was 12 Zeros lost to 4 Hellcats. The Hellcat was described by pilots as easy to fly and very stable to shoot from. Most importantly, it performed well at both high and low altitudes. The Grumman philosophy when designing the Hellcat was to make it strong, make it simple, and make it work. The Hellcat was in fact a reasonably simple machine, and it was definitely tough, and it did work extraordinarily well. The Hellcat got a reputation for its ruggedness, and even when shot up badly, it could bring its pilot home. During June 1944, the Hellcat broke the back of the Japanese Zero. This was the Battle of the Marianas, and described by one American pilot as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the day's end, the Japanese had lost 356 planes. The Allies had lost just 16. It was one of the highest American kill ratios in a single day. Without the Hellcat, it is argued that the dominance of the Japanese Zero could have turned the war. It was only the Hellcat's ability to fight off the Zero that the Pacific theatre was secured by the Allies. The statistics of the F-6F Grumman Hellcat are impressive. Its battle ratio was 19-1. Of the 6,477 Japanese planes downed over the Pacific, well over 5,000 are credited to Hellcats. The power plant in the early model was a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, 2-row radial. Hellcats had 6 half-inch Browning machine guns with 400 rounds per gun. Some had 2 20mm cannons, plus 4 half-inch machine guns and underwing attachments for 6 rockets. Their bomb payload of 2,000 pounds was carried on centre pylons. One of the characteristics of the Japanese warrior became clear from the first carrier attack. If a Japanese pilot's aircraft got shot up and he felt the plane was failing, he would try to attack the carrier with his doomed aircraft. This set the scene for brave acts later to come. The kamikaze. The Pacific Fleet was continually under attack from both carrier-launched aircraft and land-based planes. The earlier battles were a more even affair, and the later battles were very one-sided in favour of the Americans. It was the desperation that drove the Japanese to instigate the kamikaze attacks. By 1945, it was apparent that Japan was losing the war in the Pacific. Japanese Vice Admiral Takashiro Onishi had noted that the most effective way to inflict damage to American warships was to crash planes into them. He pointed out that one accidental crash could do more damage than 10 planes firing machine guns. The idea of suicide as a part of national military policy was completely new in the history of warfare. The fact that they were to go on suicide missions was accepted without question by the Japanese pilots. As the war was closing, the Americans continued to press home attacks on the mainland and systematically took out the smaller defences with carrier-based air power. These included radio ships and pickets. but the Japanese weren't keen to give in and continued with the kamikaze attacks. On March 19, 1945, several planes penetrated the outer support ship's defence and aimed for the carriers. Enterprise, Wasp, Yorktown and Franklin all took hits. The Franklin was not struck by a kamikaze as some others were. Instead, she was struck by 2 semi-armour piercing bombs. One struck the flight deck centerline, penetrating to the hangar deck, igniting fires on the second and third decks as well as knocking out the Combat Information Centre and airplot. The second hit aft, tearing through 2 decks and starting fires, which triggered ammunition, bombs and rockets. The Franklin was in 50 miles of the Japanese mainland, closer than any other US carrier had been to Japan during the war. She had launched a fighter sweep against Honshu, and later a strike against shipping in Kobe Harbour. Franklin was taken in tow by the cruiser USS Pittsburgh until she managed to work up enough steam to make 14 knots. Franklin proceeded to Pearl Harbor on her own power, where temporary repairs permitted her to sail to Brooklyn, New York, where she arrived on 28 April 1945. During repairs, everything from the hangar floor up, except the island and forward flight deck, was removed and replaced. She was surplus to requirements following the end of the war. She did not resume flight operations. She was decommissioned in 1964 and scrapped a few years later. The intensity of the kamikaze attacks was such that Admiral Spruance decided to regroup his forces into 3 task forces instead of 4, as carriers and other ships needed to withdraw to base for repairs. The Japanese wanted to increase the kamikaze pilot's chance of successful penetration of the American Navy's dense perimeter defensive fighters and anti-aircraft ships. They needed to reach the main ships in the centre. The most desirable target was the aircraft carriers. The Japanese concentrated most of the kamikaze pilot attacks during the Battle of Okinawa in 10 large attack waves of mixed kamikaze and conventional attack aircraft, in an attempt to saturate the American defences. These large attack waves, nicknamed Kikishui, were also coordinated with the Japanese naval and ground operations of the Battle of Okinawa, the war's last great battle. In the first of these kamikaze attack waves, 355 kamikaze pilots attacked the American fleet off Okinawa. The result of this massive airstrike was 6 sunk ships and 10 severely damaged. The Japanese continued to defend with ferocity, and this forced the Americans to maintain their carrier fleets off the mainland. The kamikaze tactic had been born, in part to the lack of skilled pilots. This was also a factor that was the reason the kamikaze program was not as successful as it could have been. The pilots received minimal training and didn't have the skills to fly air-to-air combat with the better trained American pilots. It was also not so easy to guide a plane to strike a ship, and many misses occurred purely from a lack of hours in training. During the Kikisui attacks, the losses were between 60 and 90% on each sortie, and these losses were not sustainable for the Japanese military. Attacks continued until war's end. However, these sorties became weaker as the Japanese ran out of planes and pilots. It got to the point that at times only an individual plane would appear. Gone were the raids that consisted of 10 planes per unit. Another problem for the Japanese was that their convoys had also been reduced, and now naval vessels and planes sat idle through a lack of fuel. A staggering 400 or more ships were destroyed by kamikaze attacks in the last 11 months of the war. But had it not been for the Grumman Hellcat, these losses could have been much greater, and may have even seen the Japanese dominant in the Pacific. The Hellcat had a water injection system installed to the engine to give the pilot short bursts of extra speed in an emergency. The engineering of the aircraft was also remarkable. Never before or since have such a great number of planes rolled out of a single factory. However, within 3 years of the delivery of the first Hellcat, the production line ceased. During the production run, over 12,000 aircraft were built. There were only 2 major subtypes of Hellcat. Not making submodels, which would have required time-consuming retooling, was one of the reasons Grumman was able to have such a high output of craft from a single factory. For all its great attributes, many Hellcats were lost. Sometimes the pilots could get the plane back to the carrier only to lose it at the last minute, or during the difficult practice of the carrier landing. On land, a crashed aircraft could be scavenged for parts and maybe even repaired. Not on a carrier. Any craft that held up or blocked the small airstrip was immediately pushed overboard. If another spare plane were available, it would be pressed into service. Crew losses were considerably light for the Hellcat pilots, as the plane was designed to give pilots as much protection as possible. However, this is not the case with the planes themselves. Many were lost, but many got their pilots home in the process. An incredible 30,000 Navy pilots had been trained by the US Navy by the end of 1942. The Japanese Navy peaked with about 3,500 trained crew in 1941. Japan could not match either the numbers or the quality of crew of their opponent. Life for the deck crew was always interesting. In this case, a phosphorus fire has occurred. Other problems saw them attending to the damaged craft. Even simple tyre blowouts could cause the deck crew with a problem that needed immediate attention. The pilots relied heavily on the deck crew. They maintained their aircraft, and the crews ensured that every plane was working to optimum performance. This was achieved under great pressure. But the maintenance teams worked exhaustively to give the air crew the greatest chance of returning. That concludes this edition of Sea Power. Join us again when we further expand our quest to broaden our understanding of this most fascinating subject, sea power.
Technology after the Second World War moved so quickly that today we have third-generation naval-class ships and are already moving into the fourth generation of vessels. After World War II, the focus was on nuclear bomb delivery and was the major priority of the superpowers, and the future role of the naval fleet was much questioned. It became evident very quickly that nuclear bombs would not replace the fleets, as most new conflicts were not going to warrant the devastation or the fallout a nuclear attack would invoke. The modern war remained more likely to be traditional, and therefore conventional weapons also received sweeping development. The Cold War was a standoff, and although nuclear armament was advancing, the conventional armed forces also developed at neck-breaking speed.
50 seconds. There it goes.
Now. Shack. Yes.
Through the FCI.
There they go. Got a good hit. Luger octane 370.
Today, a large contingent would contain many vessels and include carriers, frigates and destroyers. Replenishing vessels are also assigned and play an important role in keeping the battle group on station for extended periods. As the development moved into third-generation naval ships, a German company developed the MECO system of ship construction. The development of the three basic design principles were modularity, improvement in survivability, and signature reduction. Today, the MECO system is still subject to continuous optimization. MECO platforms are designed specifically for the varied development of standardized module weapons, electronics and the ship's technical equipment, which, in addition, are connected with the power supply, the air conditioning and ventilation system. All the components needed to run a specific system are accommodated in a single module. Depending on the particular task they are required to perform, a distinction is made between weapons, electronics, and the ship's technical modules. Containers, pallets, and mast modules are installed during the construction phase. To the customer, modularity means an immense range of choice in the selection of the onboard systems, whether it be with regard to the integration of customer-supplied systems or the use of products that the customer already has in service from various manufacturers. This principle of dedicated sectional design has been the subject of continuous refinement and expansion throughout the last 30 years of its development. In later examples, the infrared signature has been significantly reduced by dispensing with stacks and instead conducting the exhaust to the rear. Seawater spraying into the exhaust pipes, now arranged horizontally, lowers the emission temperature to less than 100 degrees Celsius. The MECO system made it possible to retrofit and convert the ships without difficulty in the shortest possible time and at a competitive cost. This is an early MECO 360 class destroyer. The Almirante Brown is an Argentinian destroyer, and she was built by Bohm and Voss in Hamburg from 1978 and was launched on March the 28th, 1981. Here, the vessel is undergoing sea trials. Sea trials are conducted to test all the systems and mechanical equipment. When the ship has passed these tests, the customer takes delivery and conducts trials of their own agenda, which may take as long as 12 months to complete. The Almirante Brown was the first of this class to be put into service and is armed with 8 aerospatial Exocet MM-40 missiles, 1 OTO Melara 5-inch gun, 8 Bofor 40mm guns, 6 324mm torpedo tubes, and 2 Breeder 105mm S-Clark chaff rocket launchers. She is powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Olympus TM3B gas turbines, which provide 51,600 shp and a top speed of 30.5 knots with a range of 7,200 kilometres. She carries 2 aerospatial SA-319B Alouette 3 helicopters for anti-submarine defence and has a crew of 26 officers and 174 men. Based on a modified German MEKO 200 design, the 10 Anzac-class frigates are the major surface units of the Royal Australian Navy and Royal New Zealand Navy. The vessels were built using modular construction techniques. Hull and superstructure modules were built in both New Zealand and Australia, and the final fit-out was conducted at the Williamstown shipyards in Melbourne, Australia. Australia made further modifications to their vessels. An upward creep in ship manning led the RAN to undertake a habitability upgrade study. Additional restructuring to the Marine Engineering Department resulted in a change in the rank and billet structure, creating a need to rework some habitation areas. Hospitability upgrades were intended to provide added flexibility for additional training bunks, force protection personnel, special operations personnel and mixed genders on board the ships by increasing the ship's berthing by 11 up from the standard 174 berths. HMAS Arunta completed her upgrade and remaining units will follow. The Harpoon anti-ship missile is being fitted to Australian units. Work was completed on the first upgraded ship, HMAS Warramunga, in 2004. For a number of reasons related to operational considerations and the electronic environment, the Harpoon installation was relocated from its reserve space and weight position on O2 deck to a position on O1 deck forward of the bridge. Remaining units will be upgraded in due course. The Australian Defence Department decided to upgrade their Anzacs even before all ships were completed. The upgraded configuration includes AGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles fitted in 2 quad launchers, evolved Sea Sparrow missiles quad packed in VLS enabling 32 missiles to be carried, 4 Nulka active missile decoys, and the petrol mine and obstacle avoidance sonar system. All upgrades and new builds are scheduled for completion by 2006. Subsequent upgrades will focus on anti-ship missile defence. Newcastle is a long-range escort, with roles including area air defence, anti-submarine warfare, surveillance, reconnaissance and interdiction. The ship is capable of countering simultaneous threats from the air, surface and subsurface. Powered by modern gas turbines, the ship can be underway from cold in 30 minutes. In addition, 2 forward-mounted retractable auxiliary propulsion units provide a secondary means of propulsion, plus excellent manoeuvrability in confined waters. Newcastle's principal weapons are the standard medium-range air-to-air missile and the Harpoon anti-ship missile. The ship is also equipped with a 76mm gun and the most effective of the close-in weapon systems, the Phalanx. Phalanx provides ships of many nations with a last chance defence against anti-ship missiles. Phalanx production started in 1978 with orders for 23 USN and 14 foreign military sail systems. Phalanx is the only deployed close-in weapon system capable of autonomously performing its own search, detect, evaluation, track, engage and kill assessment functions. For long-range anti-submarine tasks, the ship is equipped with a flight deck and 2 hangars for 2 S-70B-2 Seahawk helicopters. The ship's sensor package includes long-range radars for air and surface surveillance and is the second FFG to be fitted with the Australian-designed and built Molokar sonar. The Type 22 frigates were built in 3 batches. The latter 2 batches improved on the previous one. Intended to replace the Leander-class frigates, the early Type 22 ships were primarily designed for the anti-submarine role. The first 2 batches were the first and so far only British warships to delete a main gun from the design. The first 2 ships were built with an alternate funnel design and without torpedo tubes. The last 4 Batch 2 members were designed to carry either 2 Lynx helicopters or a single Sea King or EH-101 helicopter. The Batch 3 ships were further lengthened and incorporated for the first time a 4.5-inch gun forward in place of the Exocet launchers on the earlier batches. Although retaining the 2 Seawolf launchers, Exocet was replaced with 8 Harpoon launchers. These ships also include command facilities. As of 2005, all Batch 1 and 2 ships have been paid off and most have been sold or scrapped. Only the 4 Batch 3 ships remain in active service. Carrier development is slower than destroyer and frigate classes. The French Navy's conventionally powered Clemencia is typical of a post-World War II aircraft carrier, and due to the cost remained in service until 1997, after serving for 36 years. She was laid down in November 1955. Launched in December 1957 and commissioned in November 1961. She's replaced by a 4th-generation aircraft carrier called Charles de Gaulle. The air group was at one time made up of about 40 planes, and as aviation advances took place, the carrier's inventory of aircraft changed. A typical contingent included 2 Eurocopter Dauphin Pedro helicopters, 2 Super Freelon helicopters and 4 Dassault Etenard IVPs. 8 Vought Crusaders gave the carrier its all-weather interception capability. Plans were considered to upgrade the Crusader to the F-18 Hornet. 8 single-prop Breguet Elise aircraft that were used mainly as submarine killers. They were armed with lightweight torpedoes, depth charges and a variety of air-to-surface weapons. The Clemenceau was the 8th aircraft carrier of the French Navy, and from the 60s to the 90s she was the backbone of the French Navy, along with her sister ship, the Foch. During her career, she sailed more than 1 million nautical miles in 3,125 days at sea, on all the seas of the world. Her main missions included 1982 to 1984, the Civil War in Lebanon, 1987 to 1988, Iran-Iraq War, 1990 the First Gulf War, and from 1993 to 1996, the war in Yugoslavia. The Super Étonnard had been developed in parallel with the new air-launched version of the Aerospatiale's anti-shipping missile, the AN-39 Exocet, and these were supplied to Argentina as well. At the time of the Falklands War, Argentina had taken delivery of 5 Super Étonnards and 5 Exocets. All 5 of the missiles were used during the conflict. Britain, along with the USSR, took a different track in carrier design and built vessels that evolved around vertical takeoff and landing fighter bombers. The Invincible-class aircraft carrier is a design currently in use by the Royal Navy. There are 3 carriers of this class in operation: HMS Invincible, HMS Illustrious and HMS Ark Royal. The class design was for an escort carrier class and for anti-submarine warfare with 6 helicopters and command capability. The helicopter load was then increased to 9 and the vessel was again redesigned to a 19,500-ton carrier. The successful development of the Sea Harrier meant that the plan was reworked again to include a small complement of these STOVL aircraft. Prior to 1982, Invincible's air group consisted purely of Sea King anti-submarine aircraft and Sea Harrier aircraft. Typically, 9 Sea Kings and 4 or 5 Sea Harriers were embarked. This was due to the fact that the original envisioned mission for the ships was to provide the heart of the ASW Hunter killer groups in the North Atlantic during a war against the Soviet Union. In that context, the main weapon of the carrier would not be its fighter aircraft, but its ASW helicopters. The fighters were on board to shoot down the occasional Soviet maritime patrol aircraft nosing around the ships and its escorts. The Falklands War changed all of that, since it proved that Britain still needed to retain the capability to use carrier air power in its traditional role of power protection, both over land and against enemy fleets. It became clear after the war that the Harrier should be a permanent feature of the 3 carriers. Another addition was a new type of Sea King, airborne early warning version. Illustrious carried the first examples of the type when it was rushed south in the aftermath of the Falklands to relieve Invincible of its guard duty around the islands. In the aftermath of the Falklands, the typical air group was 3 AEW Sea Kings, 9 ASW Sea Kings and 8 or 9 Sea Harriers. In more recent years, 3 other changes have occurred. One of those was the removal of the Sea Dart system, creating an increased deck parking for aircraft. The ships have also been fitted to handle the new Merlin helicopters in the carrier airborne ASW role. Recently, Invincible was decommissioned and will remain mothballed until 2010. Illustrious is planned to decommission in 2012 and Ark Royal in 2015. As 2 new much larger aircraft carriers are planned, Britain has recently declared its plans to acquire 2 new 4th generation carriers. The new deal means BAE Systems will build 2 super carriers along with Thales, a French company. Most of the work will be carried out in various UK shipyards. The vessels will be built in several sections before bringing them together for final assembly and fitting in Scotland. The 60,000-ton carriers will be the biggest British warships ever built and are approximately 3 times the size of the current Invincible-class carriers. They will rank alongside the most formidable and complex weapon systems deployed by any country in the world. An example of the latest 4th generation of warship is the USS Winston S. Churchill. It is the US Navy's newest and most advanced warship. The USS Winston S. Churchill is the first warship to be named after a foreign leader since the American War of Independence in 1776. She is perhaps the world's most powerful destroyer. A 700 million pound ship with the equivalent power of an entire fleet of Second World War battleships. Her mission is to conduct prompt, sustained combat operations at sea. The 9,600-ton warship has a crew of 350 American officers on board. The ship's name celebrates the close relationship between the US and Britain and demonstrates the ongoing affinity of such a strong coalition.